Hey, extra historians, welcome to Lies, the part of the show where we tell you all of the mistakes we made, all the things we left out, and all the Dutch flags we flipped upside down. It's been a while since we did that. I think 1918 flu pandemic was the last time. First of all, I just want to say Lies is made possible by our Patreon patrons. We don't really get a lot from advertising on Lies, so thank you so much for making this part of Extra History possible. Extra History possible as a whole, actually, but this is a really important thing for our show to do, I really feel. And you'll really see why in this episode. Let's just get through our recommended reading so I can start knocking down historical myths. The best book you could read about this subject is A Man of Three Worlds, Samuel Palache, a Moroccan Jew in Catholic and Protestant Europe, by Mercedes Garcia Arnal and Gerard Weigers, translated by Martin Beagles. Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean by Edward Kritzler. This is a good overview. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but it has some problems with it. Barbary Pirates, 15th through 17th centuries from Osprey by Angus Constam, illustrated by Jerry Embleton. This is not necessarily doesn't mention Jewish pirates specifically, but it tells you a lot about warfare in the Mediterranean at this time with Barbary pirates. And Empires of the Sea by Roger Crowley. This is a good kind of English language source on Barbarossa, but again, doesn't mention Sinan Reis, doesn't mention Jewish pirates. We'll get to that. So let's just start off with a talking point that I have labeled, "Oh God, Internet History, why? We are part of the Internet history environment. We try to be as accurate as we possibly can within the time limits and within the art and budget constraints. And we try as much as possible not to perpetuate historical myths. One of the reasons we have Lies is so that we can straighten something out and give more context if we don't have time to put it in a 9-minute episode. But I didn't want this series to just be like knocking down historical myths about Jewish pirates or misunderstandings, because there are a whole lot of them. And you do have this kind of like internet cycle where someone will make a mistake or misunderstand something. Honestly, they're not lying. They just made a mistake, which people do all the time when they're making even writing academically history books. And it just gets repeated from blog to blog and podcast to podcast until you get this kind of giant idea cloud that says, for example, Jean Lafitte was a Jewish pirate because his mother's family were Sephardic Jews. And then you actually start digging and you're like, well, actually that's from an autobiography that was later outed as a forgery. It's pretty well known that you should not trust anything that's in this book. But that was mentioned just as an offhand thing. Not a lot of time was spent on it in Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean, and now it's kind of like become part of this internet myth. You have to be very, very careful about that with this topic specifically. Just because there hasn't been a lot of work done on it, and that work hasn't been interrogated to the extent of something like we're going to do the 30 Years' War when we did Teddy Roosevelt and trust busting. So just be cautious when you read stuff online. Don't necessarily think that's the full definitive story. And there's lots of stuff we will talk about like that, including one that's going to be our whole Ibn Battuta side trip, because it's that much of a thing. We had a really great question. We have a quarterly Q&A for our Patreon patrons, and someone asked, do we know like how these pirates conceived of themselves? Did they see themselves as Jewish? Were they conversos? Were they somewhere in between? Were they keeping on traditions, but they considered themselves Catholic? We don't know for a lot of them. I mean, obviously Samuel Palache, who the sources are pretty good on, considered himself Jewish and was very open about it. Sinan Reis, we'll get into the puzzle of Sinan Reis in our talking about episode 2. It's a little iffy. Like, we don't always know. There was a lot of professing Christianity, but maybe secretly continuing Jewish traditions or Jewish faith. You can't totally be sure unless, like I said, someone's very upfront. So that is a big question mark over some of these guys. Let's move on to patron question by Romulus Augustus. You guys said that the Spanish Inquisition was extremely harsh, but wasn't it mainly a story of Protestant merchants who were captured by the Inquisition and tortured? Then they told people what happens, hence the reputation. That did happen, and it is true that people kind of think of the Inquisition as this sort of witch hunt, frothing at the mouth kind of like mob mentality, which it was not. It was very legalistic and controlled and procedural. And everything moved forward in these very specific trial formats with lots of regulations. It doesn't mean it was good. Even if you were not killed, the number of executions that the Inquisition conducted, there's still a lot of debate about this, but it's fairly low from what people tend to believe. Like, if you look at the amount of burnings, it's somewhere between like 2,000 and 3,000, depending on what you read. It's like 1 to 5% of procedures resulted in an execution. But, just keeping someone in jail for a long time at this time can be a death sentence, right? Because of the way disease works. Even if you get accused and you get thrown in prison, right, your property is going to get confiscated. Your home might get sold and have that be used to support you, and some of it might get embezzled by the Spanish crown. So there are repressions that are not just directly someone getting executed. And it's bad in many other ways, right? We talked about the woman who was living in Macau, Portuguese China, and ended up getting sent to Portuguese India, Goa, and dying despite the fact that she was essentially cleared. So we should do at some point a whole series on the Inquisition, but it is both not necessarily what people imagine, but still very, very bad. We had a good patron question from Strong Copper. Why did the Spanish Inquisition last 3 centuries? It was a really useful tool for the Spanish state as a secret police force, essentially. They prosecuted crimes that we wouldn't think of as religious crimes. There isn't necessarily this distinction between religious and secular crime at the time. So they are prosecuting forgers. They are doing things like family morality crime, like adultery, bestiality, like sexual crime, and even things like, hey, these 2 people got married even though they knew that the man couldn't have children, or the woman was, for some reason, like could not produce children, but they got married anyway. And that's not right, because the purpose of marriage is to create babies, So it did a lot of different things, and it changed a lot over time, right? It did go after some Protestants because they were kind of considered foreign state agents, but not as much as it went after Jews. And in the 18th century, it starts to get very into going after Enlightenment thought, and particularly burning Enlightenment books, right? This is a censorship organization as well. So it's not so much just about prosecuting Jews through its whole history, though it is doing that through its whole history. It's also about really specifically doing things that are going to enforce the power of the Spanish crown. It's not solely a religious organization. It's very secular and politically oriented. There were a few discussions in different episodes over whether the people we discussed were pirates or privateers. This is a really interesting question. And like we saw with Samuel Palache, right, the definition of privateer is very squishy, right? The Spanish very specifically thought of him as a pirate. The Moroccans and the Netherlands said, no, he's definitely a privateer. And the British were kind of in the middle going like, I don't know, let's have a trial and see. One man's privateer is another man's pirate in this period. Privateering got a little more formalized as time went on. This is still fairly early days for it. We decided to not split hairs too much over it because, again, like, it depends on your point of view. Episode 1, patron question from Ison. Matt forgot to mention the Kingdom of Navarre, unless you guys meant to, which is the third kingdom with Castile and Aragon. Yes, we didn't put it in the narration, but we put it on the map. Also, the Emir of Granada lived in a palace called the Alhambra. Did this have any tie to the name of the Alhambra decree, expelling Jews and Muslims? Yes. So Ferdinand and Isabella are staying at the Alhambra. Torquemada goes down there. They talk about this problem. That's why it's the Alhambra decree. I just want to point out that this is also the same Alhambra we mentioned in the Ibn Battuta series. I love when we have those connections. Another interesting comment we had, when the decree was given, the Ottoman Sultan dispatched naval vessels to ferry Jews into his lands, as well as humanitarian concern for wanting to help fellow people of the book. He was also interested in this Jewish middle class that included a lot of mathematicians and navigators and merchants and scholars. Some of these Jewish refugees actually brought 2 printing presses into the Ottoman Empire, which were not very common in the Ottoman empire at that time. Yes, absolutely. They were more common in East Asia, and Korea and China also had movable type. But yeah, this is an interesting thing, right? Another interesting comment we had, that we mentioned the dynastic union of Castile and Aragon, but that wasn't meant to happen. Like, the daughter was meant to inherit Isabella's crown, and the son was meant to inherit Ferdinand's, but due to a lot of family complications, both crowns are jointly given to Ferdinand's grandson, Charles. Kingdoms of Aragon and Castile were technically separate into the Nueva Planta decrees of 1707. Yes, that's true. I didn't want to get too much into that because this wasn't a history of Ferdinand and Isabella, so that would be a great series to do. Similarly, I wanted to center things around the Jewish diaspora experience. Episode 2. Oh boy, I'm going to try and keep this short-ish. Is Sinan Reis a real thing? I really had this question. So, Sinan Reis is mentioned in quite a bit in Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. He's kind of a guy that floats around a bit. There are these European portraits of him and Barbarossa as Barbarossa's right-hand man. There are these mentions in a bunch of diplomatic correspondence of, quote-unquote, the famous Jewish pirate. But he's not mentioned by name in those, so whether they're talking about Sinan Reis or a different Jewish pirate could be up to interpretation. Like, just because there's one famous Jewish pirate doesn't necessarily mean that they are referencing this guy, particularly when, like, one of these references from a Portuguese governor in India, where Sinan Reis never went anywhere near it. And this is sometimes explained away of like, oh, he was just mistaken and he got some report and thought this, but I don't know. It's really complicated by the fact that it was very common in this time to dehumanize Jews by just calling them the Jew and not using their names. And then we get into things like Reis is a surname in the Ottoman Empire. Sinan is a very common name. Reis also just means like the captain or the chief. And there were other Ottoman officers that were not Jewish named Sinan Reis. So it's just this very confusing stew of references where you can definitely look at it and be like, this is a pile of circumstantial evidence and they don't necessarily all relate to the same person. And this is very confusing. And even like those portraits European painters did, right? Like, they never saw Barbarossa, and Sinan Reis could have just been one of Barbarossa's captains. And because of the novelty of him being Jewish, this was taken as like, oh, he's Barbarossa's right-hand man, and this was just sort of like a thing that European artists built up in their imaginations. We don't know. I tried to be as careful and circumspect as possible with this episode, but it was honestly kind of a nightmare. There was something a little off about it to me, to the point where I dove into the footnotes on Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean, which had a chapter on Sinan Reis, and found this other book called Sea Wolves of the Mediterranean. And I was like, great, I'm going to go read this book, Sea Wolves of the Mediterranean, and see what the deal is with Sinan Reis. This book is Sea Wolves of the Mediterranean, the Grand Period of Muslim Corsairs, was written by H. Hamilton Curry in 1910. It's sometimes published under the name Flag of the Prophet. Was he a historian? No. As far as I can tell, he was a commander in the Royal Navy who died in World War I at the age of 59 aboard a ship called the HMS Eagle, which I also could not track down very well because apparently there was an HMS Eagle, but I don't know if it was actually in service in 1916. It seems to have gone to service in 1918. I went through like a bunch of Commonwealth War Graves Commission stuff on this. Didn't really lead me anywhere about his qualifications for writing this book. It didn't cite any sources. Some of it sounded a little iffy to me. So I finally was just like, well, let's do the episode. I'll cut out anything that I think seems like an exaggeration, then we'll talk about this in light. But again, this is why you need to be careful sometimes with history. You just never know what layers of interpretation something has gone through. Maybe Turkish sources, which are not available in English, would clear this up. If someone has read them, I would love to hear about it in the comments, because this is still driving me absolutely crazy. The main story I cut out about Sinan Reis, I also very specifically labeled things as there is a story, not this is what happened. But there is this story about Sinan Reis' son getting captured by Emperor Charles and being held at Elba, and Barbarossa trying to ransom him and not succeeding, and then like bombarding and invading part of Elba to sack a town and force them to hand over Sinan Reis' kid. But maybe that is... I found this story on some tourism websites for Elba, but like I couldn't find anything in like a academic book on it. So Sinan Reis is not even mentioned in Empires of the Sea, which is kind of the classic book on warfare in the Mediterranean that everyone reads in English. So I don't know. I think Sinan Reis existed. I don't know if he was as pivotal as has sometimes been claimed, but I could absolutely be wrong about that. I didn't feel comfortable going out on my own and saying like, I don't know if this was a thing, you know. We had an interesting comment. We talked about where the term Sephardic Jew comes from, but for further information, Ashkenazi Jews are Jewish people who were expelled from France and Germany in the Holy Roman Empire. Yeah, I got my Passover matzah here. We have so much of this left over. I'm just like eating it with avocado at this point. Patron question on episode 3. We're on very solid ground with Samuel Palache. He is very well sourced. I just want to say. And you should definitely read A Man of Three Worlds. Patron question from Ison. What happened to Samuel Palache's brother? For the sake of time, we sort of sidelined him, but basically they were a double act through this whole time. Samuel Palache was doing all of the piracy stuff, and his brother was doing all of the merchant stuff. Like his brother was running kind of like the merchant empire, or his family like merchant concern. Well, that was related to what Samuel was doing, right? Because they're doing stuff like arms shipments, right? And his brother is doing all this kind of stuff. I love Samuel Palache. He's my favorite in this whole series. I love the episode on Samuel Palache. He's just such a fascinating figure, and I like rogues. I like scoundrels a lot, as you could probably tell from watching this show for the last couple of years. The whole Jonathan Wild thing, love that. A Man of Three Worlds is fascinating. It goes into a lot more detail than we could do in a single episode, and how involved he was in Jewish institutions in Amsterdam, which sometimes gets overstated too. He was not necessarily as central as has sometimes been portrayed. Like I said, there's a lot of iffy stuff getting passed around about this topic. The Dutch flag. All right, so we managed to flip the Dutch flag upside down in a couple episodes. I think I may have caught it in the second episode, but it was like on a chalkboard where there was all this confusion going on. I was like, oh, that's kind of funny. Like it's upside down. Maybe we'll just keep it. But I can't even remember if I did that as consciously or not. But so sorry about that. There was a lot of discussion about whether the red stripe, or there should be a red stripe or an orange stripe on the flag. So I actually looked into this quite heavily when I was proofing the flag. Somehow I had my pattern recognition thing, flipped it upside down though, and I didn't recognize that. But I do have a really fun answer for the color, which is that there are some people, well, it wasn't standardized this time, so it might have been red or orange, depending on your preference, but there is a theory that it's orange in a lot of these paintings of Dutch ships, particularly because it's celebrating the Prince of Orange. But there's also a theory that they just used kind of cruddy ink, and that it was originally red and it would just fade to orange, and they kind of were like, it's orange for the Prince of Orange now, let's just keep it. So I don't know, I like that second one. Again, people are not necessarily sure. Episode 4, Marina de Morris had a really good comment about that we probably should have specified that Dutch Brazil was not the whole of Brazil, it was just a specific area, the city of Recife and its environs. Yes, I have a very strict word limit on episodes, so anything we can portray visually, I often like kick to the artist, like, hey, you know, can we have a map that just shows the area of Dutch Brazil so that people don't think it's all of Brazil. Somehow that fell through the cracks. Probably I just didn't put an art note in it. And we didn't end up doing something visually that would have differentiated that. So thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification. A couple of really interesting comments on this out of Brazil. A lot of Portuguese conversos actually immigrated to Brazil, especially the Northeast. This is the area of Dutch Brazil, Conversos were usually adopted trees for their last names, so a lot of people who have last names like Carvalho or Oliveira are descendants of Conversos. Super cool. I did read that in the research, but I wasn't able to. It was one of the things that I was like, oh, I don't have time for this. So thank you for bringing it up and reminding me to talk about it. Another fun fact: the Brazilian city invaded by the Dutch actually kept everything the Dutch built there. It's the city of Recife in northeastern Brazil, and it has all this Dutch colonial architecture. Yeah, I always think this is really fascinating, where you have these sort of like Dutch or Portuguese or Spanish cities in places where they seemingly just like don't belong, right? You have that in Goa in India or Macau right next door to us in Hong Kong. And I was really happy to slip Macau in there and be like, hey, Inquisition was in Macau too. Yeah, that's always really fascinating where you're like, I'm in the middle of China and this is a Portuguese European town square I am standing in. And that pretty much wraps it up. Next on Extra History is the 30 Years' War. We're doing a sort of interesting investigative way of doing the 30 Years' War because I couldn't do the whole thing in one series, and it's something I thought we could return to after we had a basis. So what we're doing is we're basically doing a 5-part investigation on how the 30 Years' War, with the technology level that was present at the time, managed to kill 4 to 8 million people. Like, how do you have this high a body count, most of it civilian? And we break it up by the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse from the King James Bible. So we do an episode on conquest, war, famine, and death, basically plague and disease. And then we have one on the Peace of Westphalia. So that's just sort of a groundwork one so that we can maybe go back and do more really specific military stuff. After that is Vlad the Impaler. I'm just finishing up writing these. These are tons of fun. I didn't plan it this way. We're doing a lot of Eastern European stuff. Then we have a 4-parter on Rasputin and a 2-parter, this is very exciting, on the Great Emu War. We have an excellent guest writer who's doing this for us, and I can't wait to see what they turn in. After that, it's your vote. By the time this is out, the vote will be over, but if you want to vote on future topics, you can join our Patreon. And we thank you very much for supporting us if you already have. And let's just jump real quick into Ibn Battuta's side trip. Let's talk about Sinan Reis and his Star of David pirate flag. This is something that you will hear about a lot in podcasts, on blogs, even newspaper articles. It's not something from Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. I expected to get there, and because it wasn't in there, I was like, where did this come from? And also, what did it look like? Like, I want to know what this looked like. Is there a reconstruction? That just sounds so cool. I was going to open the series with it. But the more I looked, the more I just couldn't find it. And then what I finally landed on was that is just Barbarossa's flag. That's Barbarossa's flag for Barbarossa's fleet. And it has this hexagram at the bottom that looks like a Star of David. But this was not an exclusively Jewish symbol at the time. At the time, it was called the Seal of Solomon, and this was a thing in both Islamic and Jewish folklore and esoteric belief. There's all these stories in Islamic belief about how King Solomon would essentially like enslave genies to build his temple, and he had this ring that had the Seal of Solomon on it, and he would use this like ring of power to command the jinn to do whatever he wished. And that's this symbol was like all over Christian churches, all over Islamic iconography. Because when you look at the flag, you're like, that's not really a Star of David because there's all this Islamic iconography on it. Also, this is clearly an Islamic flag that it just has this hexagram on. And the way that this ends up being almost exclusively related to Judaism is in the 19th century, Zionist movements in Eastern Europe increasingly started adopting this as a Jewish symbol. And in 1897, there's the first Zionist Congress, and they create a flag with the Shield of Solomon on it. Often it was called the Shield of Solomon in Jewish and Kabbalah iconography. And increasingly, this becomes adopted as an exclusively Jewish symbol. The British British Army starts using it as the Jewish symbol on tombstones in the First World War, and that's where it really starts to take off as like not exclusively, but mostly Jewish symbol, universally recognized as a Jewish symbol. And then, of course, it gets incorporated into the flag of Israel. So this, again, just be careful when you hear stuff like that. Always ask the next question of like, oh, that's really interesting. Where'd you get that information? Maybe I should look it up. History has a lot of misinformation and a lot of misunderstanding that sometimes get passed around. Thank you for joining us. I really enjoyed this series. I hope you'll enjoy our next two, which will have already gone on the conquest of the Matterhorn. And see you next time for the 30 Years' War. Have a nice day.
A legendary thanks to Ahmed Ziad Turk, Joseph Blame, Alicia Bramble, Kyle Murgatroyd, Casey Muscha, O'Reels One, and Dominic Valenciana for all of their support.